The signal arrived on a Tuesday, which felt far too ordinary for the end of humanity's solitude. It didn't come as a voice or a string of prime numbers crackling through the static. It came as a whisper in the dark, a subtle, patterned tremor in the fabric of space-time itself. At the Atacama Large Millimeter Array in the high desert of Chile, alarms, silent and digital, flashed across a dozen screens. Gravitational wave detectors, designed to hear the echoes of colliding black holes, registered a ripple that was impossibly quiet, impossibly deliberate. It was a wave that carried information. Dr. Eris Thorne had been waiting for this moment her entire life, and now that it was here, she felt a profound and unsettling calm. For 10 years, her work had been relegated to the fringes of astrophysics, her theories on non-electromagnetic intelligence signatures politely dismissed as speculative. She remembered her doctoral defense, the condescending smile of Professor Millward as he'd called her thesis a charming piece of science fiction. She had argued that a sufficiently advanced civilization would abandon the crude inefficiencies of radio waves, communicating instead through the fundamental forces that bound the universe together. They would write their messages in the language of gravity, their words echoing in the curvature of space. Her colleagues had called it poetry, not science. Now, the poem had arrived. The data streamed into her modest lab, a cramped annex off the main control room that she'd fought for years to keep funded. On her primary monitor, the wave resolved itself not into a sound, but into a shape. It was a breathtakingly complex fractal, a multi-layered structure of nested symmetries that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic cadence. It was language, not of words, but of mathematics, of physics. It was a statement of existence, as undeniable as a star. Iris traced the glowing lines with her finger, her breath fogging the cold screen. She felt like a cartographer seeing a new continent for the first time. For a long moment, she was the only person on Earth who knew they were no longer alone. Then, the door to her lab burst open, and the world rushed in. It was her department head, Doctor. Ben Haim, his face pale, his usual academic bluster replaced by a wide-eyed awe. He stared at her screen, then at her, clutching a tablet that showed cascading error messages from the main array. Ben Haim said, "Iris, the entire array is resonating. It's not an equipment malfunction, it's singing. What is this?" Iris Thorne, vindicated and terrified in equal measure, replied softly, "It's a greeting." Within hours, the greeting had become a global crisis. The information was too fundamental to contain. The signal, dubbed the Thorne anomaly by media scrambling for a headline, was confirmed by every gravitational observatory on the planet and in orbit. It was intelligent, it was unambiguous, and it was coming from the direction of Proxima Centauri. A hastily assembled consortium of world leaders, operating under the opaque banner of the Aegis Council, convened in a secure bunker beneath Geneva. The question on every screen, in every hushed conversation, was the same. What do we do now? The answer, to Iris's astonishment, was to summon her. She found herself in a sterile, circular chamber, the air tasting of recycled oxygen and anxiety. A holographic display in the center of the room showed the fractal waveform, rotating silently like a captured ghost. Around the table sat the most powerful people on the planet. Among them were two faces she knew all too well. The first was Director Eva Rostova, the civilian head of the Aegis Council. Her face was a mask of severe, pragmatic control, her eyes missing nothing. She was a creature of politics, of leverage and advantage, and she looked at the alien signal not with wonder, but with a cold, calculating assessment of its potential threat and opportunity. The second face was the one that made Iris's breath catch in her throat. General Marcus Thorne, commander of the United States Space Force, and her estranged father. He stood with his arms crossed, his uniform immaculate, his jaw set with the same stubborn intensity she saw in her own mirror. His presence was a physical weight in the room, a reminder of a lifetime of ideological conflict. He saw the universe in terms of strategy, of high ground and acceptable losses. He looked at the signal and saw a potential enemy. He looked at his daughter and saw a liability. Rostova spoke first, her voice cutting through the tension. Rostova said, "Dr. Thorne, your theories, it seems, were correct. You are, for the moment, the world's foremost expert on a subject we didn't know existed an hour ago. We need to know what we're dealing with. Is it a threat?" Aris stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the waveform, avoiding her father's stare. Aris said, "Director, calling it a threat is like an ant calling a boot a threat. The term is meaningless. We are dealing with a civilization that can manipulate gravity as a communication medium, that puts them on a level of physical understanding that we can barely model. They are not a threat. They are a context in which humanity is no longer the most significant intelligence." Her father scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound. General Thorne said, "Idealism is a luxury we can't afford, Aris. Capability equals intent until proven otherwise. They can manipulate gravity. That means they can create weapons that would make our nuclear arsenal look like firecrackers. Our first and only priority must be security." Aris turned to face him, the old, familiar fire rising in her. Aris said, "And what does security mean, Father? Hiding under a rock? They know we're here. The signal is incredibly precise. It's aimed directly at our solar system. They chose to whisper, not to shout. That, in itself, is a gesture. They are initiating a conversation, and your first instinct is to point a gun?" Rostova held up a hand, silencing them both. Rostova said, "Enough. The debate is noted. Doctor, your task is to decipher this. Not just the physics, but the meaning, the intent. General, your task is to prepare for the worst-case scenario. I want a full-spectrum defense protocol drawn up by the time the sun rises. You have the world's resources at your disposal. Do not fail." For the next 3 weeks, Aris lived in the bunker, fueled by caffeine and the sheer, terrifying thrill of discovery. Her small team of physicists and linguists worked around the clock, breaking down the complex wave. They discovered it wasn't a single message, but a nested library of information. The outer layers were a universal primer. The fundamental constants of the universe, the periodic table, the structure of a hydrogen atom. It was a Rosetta Stone written in the language of reality itself. Deeper within, they found biology, astronomy, history. It was the story of a species that called themselves the Resonance. They were not biological, not in any way humans understood. They were beings of coherent energy, vast, distributed consciousnesses that existed in the delicate balance of gravitational and quantum forces. They were born in the hearts of neutron stars, and they lived in the silent, empty spaces between galaxies. Their history was measured in epochs, their perception of time as fluid as a river. And buried in the heart of the message, the team found one final piece of information, a set of coordinates. It was a Lagrange point, a gravitationally stable island in the void between two long-dead stars, a perfect neutral meeting ground. It was an invitation. The debate in the Aegis Council was ferocious. General Thorne argued it was a trap. Rostova argued it was a test. Aris argued it was the single most important opportunity in human history. In the end, a fragile consensus was reached. They would go. A single vessel, humanity's most advanced starship, the Stellamar, would make the journey. On board would be a skeleton crew, a security contingent under the command of General Thorne, a diplomatic team led by Director Rostova, and a science team led by Dr. Eris Thorne. She would be the interface, the translator, the first human to speak to an alien intelligence. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than gravity itself. The journey to the L, 2-point of the binary brown dwarf system designated WD 0137-349, was a masterclass in contained tension. The Stellamar was a marvel of engineering, its sleek, obsidian hull cutting through the void powered by a contained singularity drive that warped space-time in a gentle, continuous fall. But inside, the atmosphere was anything but gentle. The three factions on board, science, diplomacy, and military, circled each other with wary distrust. Aris spent most of her time in the forward observation lounge, a vast bubble of transparent aluminum that looked out onto the star-dusted blackness. She was trying to build a lexicon, a way to translate the messy, emotional, illogical concepts of humanity into the pure, mathematical language of the resonance. How do you explain hope to a being that perceives time as a simultaneous whole? How do you translate the concept of peace to a species that has no biology, no need for resources, and therefore no history of war? Her father found her there one cycle, the ship's artificial day turning to a soft, simulated twilight. He stood beside her, his reflection a uniformed ghost against the backdrop of the cosmos. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in a voice quieter than she was used to, he spoke. General Thorne said, "You're thinking I'm a fool, a warmonger?" Aris didn't look at him. Aris said, "I'm thinking you see everything as a nail because the only tool you have is a hammer." He sighed, a sound of genuine weariness. General Thorne said, "That hammer has kept humanity safe for a century, Aris. While scientists like you were looking at the stars, people like me were dealing with a messy reality on the ground. We've learned the hard way that you prepare for the worst and you pray for the best. This is the biggest worst we've ever faced." Aris said, "And I think it's the biggest best. That's the difference between us." He put a hand on her shoulder, a rare, hesitant gesture. General Thorne said, "Just be careful. Don't let your wonder blind you to the risks. Not everything that shines is a star. Some things are the engines of approaching warships." He turned and left, the silence he left behind heavier than his words. They arrived at the coordinates. The space was empty, profoundly so. 2 dead stars, faint and brown, circled each other in a silent, gravitational dance. The Stellamar cut its engines, floating in the perfect stillness of the Lagrange point. For hours, nothing happened. The tension on the bridge was a physical thing, a tightening in the chest. General Thorne had his hand on the console that controlled the ship's defensive systems. Rostova's face was a blank slate, betraying nothing. And then it appeared. It didn't warp in or decloak. It simply resolved. One moment, there was empty space. The next, there was a perfect sphere, 3 kilometers in diameter, hanging in the void before them. It was a sphere of absolute blackness, absorbing all light, all sensor readings. It was a hole in the universe. Aris knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was looking at a member of the Resonance. It wasn't a ship. It was a being. A channel opened, not on the comms, but directly in the ship's quantum computing core. The fractal waveform appeared on the main view screen, pulsing gently. It was waiting. Aris took her place at the translation interface, a specialized chair that linked her neural impulses to the ship's transmission systems. She would not speak with her voice, but with her mind, shaping the raw data of the ship's systems into the complex gravitational patterns the resonance used. She took a deep breath, the scent of ozone and filtered air filling her lungs, and sent the first message. It was a simple, elegant packet of information. A map of the human genome, the structure of DNA, the double helix spiraling in a graceful dance, a statement of what they were. This is us. This is life. The response was instantaneous. The black sphere, the nexus, pulsed once, a deep, slow thrum of gravitational energy that washed over the stellamar. The ship's inertial dampeners groaned, but held. On the screen, a new fractal appeared. It was a representation of a consciousness, not biological, but mathematical. A vast, interconnected network of pure thought, a mind the size of a solar system. This is us. This is thought. The conversation had begun. For days, they exchanged information, a slow, careful dance of diplomacy and discovery. Aris learned that the resonance was a collective, a single, unified consciousness composed of trillions of individual nodes, like the one before them. They were explorers, cartographers of reality, their goal the simple, profound accumulation of knowledge. Rostova, ever the pragmatist, pushed for the next step. Rostova said, "Knowledge is a resource, Doctor. We need to establish a framework for trade." Aris relayed the concept. Trade, the exchange of unique resources for mutual benefit. The nexus was silent for a long time. The gravitational field around it seemed to deepen, to grow more complex. Then the response came, and it was a concept that shattered the foundation of the human negotiation strategy. We understand. We propose a trade. Your unique resource is your mode of existence, individuality, the experience of a singular, mortal consciousness. Our resource is our own, a unified, immortal, collective consciousness. We propose a full exchange, a symbiosis. We will merge. On the bridge of the Stellamar, the silence was absolute. Merge. The word hung in the air, heavy and monstrous. Rostova's face was ashen. General Thorne's hand clenched into a fist. Rostova said, her voice a choked whisper, "Assimilation. They want to absorb us." General Thorne said, "It's a declaration of war. They're not explorers, they're conquerors. A virus looking for a host." Aris stared at the screen, her mind reeling. Merge. Was it conquest, or was it communion? A way of knowing so profound it was beyond human experience. She saw the beauty in it, the terrifying, sublime logic. To know the universe as a god knows it. But at what cost? The end of humanity as they knew it. The end of the individual. The end of her. Aris said, her voice trembling, "No. You're wrong. It's not conquest, it's connection. They don't understand individuality. They see it as a state of isolation, of loneliness. They're offering us a cure." Her father turned on her, his face a mask of fury. General Thorne said, "A cure? That's what you call extinction? I knew you were a liability. You're compromised. You're so desperate to see the best that you can't see the monster in front of you." He turned to his tactical officer. General Thorne said, "Commander, I want a full-spectrum analysis of that sphere. Find a weakness. I am invoking Protocol Omega. This is now a first-contact hostile engagement." Rostova shouted, "General, stand down. You do not have that authority." Aris screamed, "Father, no! You don't know what you're doing. Their language is physical. A scan is not a passive act. It's a shout. It's a violent intrusion." But it was too late. The general's command had been given. A tightly focused beam of neutrinos, designed for deep space geological scanning, lanced out from the stellamar and struck the surface of the nexus. For the resonance, a being of pure, delicate wave mechanics, the neutrino beam was an act of unimaginable violence. It was not a scan. It was a physical blow, a dissonant, chaotic blast of energy that tore through its coherent thought patterns. It was pain. And its reaction was instantaneous, instinctual, and defensive. The black sphere did not fire a weapon. It simply contracted. The gravitational field around it intensified 1,000-fold in a microsecond. The space around the stellamar warped violently. Alarms shrieked across the bridge as the ship was seized in a tidal grip. The hull groaned, metal screaming in protest. On the view screen, the fractal waveform of the resonance had vanished, replaced by a chaotic, jagged spike of pure, defensive rage. Red lights flashed. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks. The artificial gravity failed, plunging the crew into a terrifying weightlessness. The stellamar was being crushed, its systems failing, its hull buckling. They were going to die, here in the silent dark, killed not by a laser or missile, but by a misunderstanding. Aris, strapped into her interface chair, fought to stay conscious. The ship was screaming, her father was shouting orders, Rostova was trying to restore control. But Aris knew none of it mattered. There was only one way out. She had to talk to them, not as a diplomat, not as a scientist, but as a person. She closed her eyes, shutting out the chaos of the dying bridge. She pushed aside the complex lexicons and translation protocols. She reached for the core of the transmission system, the part that regulated the ship's own quantum state. It was a dangerous, untested maneuver. She was going to transmit not a constructed message, but a raw, unfiltered stream of her own consciousness. Her memories, her fears, her hopes, her argument with her father, her awe at seeing the stars, her love for a world she was about to lose. It was the ultimate act of vulnerability, a complete surrender of her individual self. It was the only language they had left. She pushed. The universe dissolved into a torrent of pure information. Her life, from her first memory to her last, poured out of the stellamar in a wave of quantum entanglement. It was a signal of pure, chaotic, beautiful humanity. It was a single, desperate voice, crying out in the dark. This is what it is to be one. To be alone, to be afraid, to love, to die. This is me. The crushing pressure on the ship vanished. The gravitational field stabilized. The alarms fell silent. On the main screen, the jagged spike of the resonance's anger softened, resolved, and transformed. A new fractal appeared. It was different from the others. It was less symmetrical, more complex. It contained a flaw, an imperfection at its heart. It was the waveform of a question. The voice of the resonance filled the bridge, not through the comms, but in the minds of every human there. It was not a voice of words, but of pure, empathetic understanding. You are not a chorus. You are a symphony of single notes. We did not understand. The value of the note is not in its merging with the whole, but in its unique contribution to the song. We see now. The loneliness is the source of the beauty. A wave of calm washed over the ship. The nexus pulsed, a soft, gentle rhythm. It was the frequency of an apology. It transmitted a new proposal, not symbiosis, not a merger, a harmonic exchange, a library of knowledge, a bridge between species, where either could learn from the other without sacrificing what they were. A promise of communication, of understanding, of coexistence. The Stellamar, battered but intact, turned for home. The journey back was quiet, contemplative. The factions were gone, replaced by a single, unified crew who had stared into the abyss and survived. In the observation lounge, Iris stood with her father, watching the stars of home grow brighter. General Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was wrong, Iris. I saw a monster, but it wasn't them. It was me, my fear, my pride." Iris looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not a general, but just a man, her father. Iris said, "Fear is part of the song, Dad. It's just not the whole symphony." He nodded, a single, sharp gesture of acceptance. A lifetime of conflict, resolved in the silent space between stars. When they returned, they were not greeted as heroes or as failures, but as messengers. The story they told, the data they brought back, changed everything. The harmonic exchange was ratified. Humanity began the slow, careful process of talking to its neighbors. The age of solitude was over. The age of conversation had begun. Iris Thorne often returned to the observatory in the high desert. She would stand under the vast, silent dishes, looking up at the night sky, a sky that was no longer empty, but filled with the promise of 1 billion different notes, 1 billion different songs, all waiting to be heard. Humanity's note was just one in that cosmic symphony, but she knew, with a certainty that warmed her soul, that it was a beautiful one, and it would, from now on, be heard.